My name is Carol Martinez. I'm 68 years old, and 3 months ago my daughter had me committed to Sunset Manor elder care against my will while she cleaned out my life savings. I found out she'd been planning this for over a year when I discovered documents she thought I'd never see. Has anyone here ever been betrayed by the person you trusted most in the world? If you've experienced something similar, share your story in the comments below. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you how this all unfolded. I wasn't some confused elderly woman losing her grip on reality. At 68, I was still teaching part-time Spanish literature at the community college, managing my own finances, driving myself everywhere, and living independently in the house I'd owned for 32 years. My mind was sharp, my body was healthy, and I had plans for my retirement that didn't involve being warehoused in a facility that smelled like disinfectant and defeat. But my daughter Rebecca saw things differently. She saw an opportunity disguised as concern, and she took it. Rebecca was always the ambitious one. Even as a child, she'd figure out elaborate schemes to get what she wanted, convincing her teachers she needed extra credit projects just so she could stay after school and avoid chores at home. I thought it was cleverness back then. I was proud of her drive when she graduated with her MBA, when she landed that corporate consulting job, when she bought her first house at 28. I bragged about her to my neighbors, to my colleagues, to anyone who would listen. My daughter, the success story. What I didn't realize was that Rebecca had been studying me the same way she studied her business deals, looking for weaknesses, calculating risks, planning her moves years in advance. It started small, the way these things always do. About 18 months ago, she began visiting more frequently, which I initially welcomed. She'd show up on weekends with coffee and pastries, asking how I was feeling, whether I was sleeping well, if I'd been forgetting things. At first, her attention felt like love. I'd been lonely since her father passed 5 years earlier, and having my daughter check on me regularly made me feel cared for. But then the questions became more pointed. She'd ask about my medications, whether I'd been taking them correctly. She'd notice if I'd moved furniture around and ask why I'd changed things. She started commenting on my driving, suggesting maybe I shouldn't go out after dark. Maybe I should consider grocery delivery instead of shopping myself. Each suggestion came wrapped in concern, delivered with the kind of gentle firmness that made me question my own judgment. Looking back, I can see she was building a case. Every comment I made about feeling tired, every time I mentioned misplacing my reading glasses, every small confusion about a date or appointment, became evidence in her mental file that I was declining. She never said it outright, but the implication was always there, hovering between us like smoke. The real manipulation began when she started involving my doctor. Rebecca had always been charming, the kind of person who could make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. She began accompanying me to my routine appointments, claiming she wanted to stay involved in my healthcare. Dr. Patterson seemed impressed by her attentiveness, and I was touched that she cared enough to take time off work. During these visits, Rebecca would mention incidents that either never happened or were drastically exaggerated. She'd tell Dr. Patterson that I'd called her 3 times in one night, confused about what day it was, or that she'd found me wandering in my backyard in my nightgown looking lost. None of this was true, but she said it with such conviction, such worried daughter authenticity, that even I started to doubt my own memory. Dr. Patterson began suggesting cognitive assessments, talking about the importance of having support systems in place as we age. He recommended that Rebecca and I start discussing my future care needs, maybe look into community resources for seniors. At the time, I thought he was being proactive. I didn't realize Rebecca had been priming him with carefully crafted stories designed to make him see me as a woman in decline. The financial piece started around the same time, but so subtly I almost missed it entirely. Rebecca offered to help me organize my paperwork, said she wanted to make sure everything was in order in case of emergency. She convinced me to add her name to my checking account for convenience, just so she could help with bills if I ever needed it. She suggested we meet with my financial advisor together, so she'd know how to handle things if something happened to me. I agreed to all of it, because it seemed responsible, the kind of planning any smart person would do. Rebecca presented herself as the devoted daughter who wanted to protect me, and I wanted to believe that's all it was. When she suggested I sign a power of attorney document, she framed it as a safety net, something that would only be activated if I became truly incapacitated. The paperwork looked official, she'd had it prepared by a lawyer, and she assured me it was just a precaution. What I didn't know was that the power of attorney she'd prepared was far more comprehensive than she'd explained. It gave her immediate authority over my finances, my medical decisions, and my living arrangements. It was a weapon disguised as protection, and I'd signed it willingly. The timeline accelerated last fall. Rebecca's visits became more frequent, but also more clinical. She'd show up with notebooks, taking inventory of my house, asking detailed questions about my daily routines, my medications, my social activity. She started suggesting that maintaining such a large house was becoming too much for me, that I should consider something smaller, more manageable. She brought brochures for senior living communities, glossy pamphlets showing smiling elderly people playing cards and tending gardens. She'd spread them across my kitchen table like travel brochures, talking about how much easier life would be without the burden of home maintenance, how much safer I'd be with medical staff nearby, how much more social stimulation I'd have. I wasn't interested. I loved my house, loved my independence, loved my life exactly as it was. But Rebecca was persistent, the way water eventually wears down stone. She'd leave the brochures behind after each visit, bringing new ones the next time, gradually escalating from independent living communities to assisted living facilities to full care homes. When I continued to resist, she changed tactics. She started expressing concern about my safety, pointing out how isolated I was, how far the nearest hospital was, what would happen if I fell and couldn't reach the phone. She'd mention news stories about elderly people found days after accidents, painting vivid pictures of worst-case scenarios that made my comfortable solitude seem dangerous and irresponsible. The pressure intensified after Thanksgiving. Rebecca had hosted dinner at her house, and I'd had a wonderful time playing with my two grandsons, catching up with her husband David, feeling like part of a family again. But during the drive home, Rebecca started one of her talks about my future, about how much she worried about me living alone, about how the holidays made her realize how much she missed having me closer. She suggested I spend Christmas week at her house, just to try out what it would be like to have family nearby all the time. I agreed, thinking it would be nice to have an extended visit with the boys. What I didn't realize was that Rebecca was setting the stage for the final act of her plan. The week at Rebecca's house was pleasant enough, but I noticed she was documenting everything. She'd make subtle comments about my confusion over her television remote, my difficulty hearing conversations when multiple people were talking, my tendency to nap in the afternoon. She'd mention these observations to David in front of me, as if I weren't there, discussing my limitations like symptoms of decline. On December 30th, Rebecca announced that she'd scheduled a comprehensive health evaluation for me, something she'd arranged as a late Christmas gift. She said she wanted to make sure I was in good health going into the new year, that it would give us both peace of mind. The appointment was at a facility I'd never heard of, but she assured me it was thorough and highly recommended. The evaluation was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of routine blood work and basic physical checks, I found myself subjected to hours of cognitive testing, psychological assessments, and interviews about my daily functioning. The staff treated me like I was already impaired, speaking slowly and loudly, asking if I understood simple instructions, having me perform tasks that felt designed to make me appear confused or incapable. Rebecca was present for most of it, answering questions about my behavior at home, providing examples of incidents that painted me as increasingly unable to care for myself. I tried to correct her exaggerations, but the evaluator seemed more interested in her observations than my protest. When I insisted I was perfectly capable of living independently, they nodded sympathetically and made notes that I'm sure described me as lacking insight into my condition. The results, delivered 2 days later. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Recommended immediate placement in a supervised care environment. The report detailed cognitive decline, safety concerns, and social isolation that supposedly put me at significant risk. Reading it was like looking at a description of someone else entirely, but it was signed by licensed professionals and backed by hours of testing. Rebecca had tears in her eyes when she showed me the report. She said she'd been hoping for different results, that she'd wanted the evaluation to prove she was wrong to be concerned, but faced with professional recommendations, she said we had no choice but to take action. She'd already researched facilities and found one with an immediate opening, a place she described as comfortable and well-staffed. That's how I found myself, 3 days later, being driven to Sunset Manor Elder Care with 2 suitcases of clothes and a folder of paperwork I wasn't allowed to read thoroughly. Rebecca had handled all the arrangements, signed all the documents, and presented the whole thing as a temporary measure, until we could figure out next steps. But as we pulled into the circular driveway of a low brick building surrounded by landscaping that couldn't disguise its institutional nature, I knew this wasn't temporary. This was where Rebecca intended for me to disappear. The intake process was swift and efficient. Rebecca had prepared extensively, providing medical records, financial information, and legal documents that gave her authority to make decisions on my behalf. I was assigned a room, given a schedule of activities, and introduced to staff who spoke to me like I was a child rather than a retired professor who'd been managing her own life successfully for decades. Rebecca stayed for the orientation, helping me unpack my belongings into a room half the size of my walk-in closet at home. She promised to visit regularly, to bring the boys to see me, to make sure I had everything I needed. But when she hugged me goodbye, I could feel her relief. She'd solved her problem. She'd cleared the obstacle that stood between her and whatever she really wanted. That first night at Sunset Manor, lying in a narrow bed, listening to my roommate's labored breathing and the constant hum of medical equipment in the hallway, I realized that everything Rebecca had told me about this being for my own good was a lie. This wasn't about my safety or my health or my well-being. This was about removing me from the equation so she could pursue some agenda I hadn't yet figured out. But I was going to figure it out. Because despite what the evaluation report claimed, despite what Rebecca had convinced everyone, my mind was still sharp. And now, for the first time in months, I had something Rebecca hadn't planned for. I had time to think, time to remember, and time to piece together what she'd really been doing while she was so carefully building her case for my incompetence. The staff at Sunset Manor treated all residents the same way regardless of their actual mental capacity. We were managed rather than respected, scheduled rather than consulted, medicated rather than listened to. My protests about being there against my will were noted in my chart as agitation and confusion. My requests to speak with someone about my legal rights were met with suggestions that I discuss my concerns with my daughter during her next visit. But Rebecca's visits became increasingly infrequent. After the first week, when she'd come daily to help me settle in, her appearances dropped to twice a week, then once a week, then every other week. When she did come, our conversations were superficial and brief. She'd ask how I was feeling, whether I was making friends, if I needed anything from the gift shop. She avoided any discussion of when I might be able to leave or return home. It was during her third week of visits that I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Rebecca was wearing a bracelet I'd never seen before, an expensive-looking piece with diamonds that caught the light when she gestured. When I complimented it, she said it was a gift from David, a reward for handling a difficult family situation with such grace and maturity. That phrase stuck with me, handling a difficult family situation. As if my entire life had been reduced to a problem she'd solved. I started paying closer attention during her visits, noticing details I'd missed before. Her clothes were more expensive, her handbag was designer, her manicure was perfect. She mentioned in passing that they'd hired a housekeeper, that David had gotten a promotion, that they were considering private school for the boy. All improvements in their lifestyle that seemed to have coincided perfectly with my removal from my own life. When I asked about my house, Rebecca's answers became vague. She said she was taking care of everything, that I didn't need to worry about maintenance or bills, that she was handling it all through the power of attorney I'd signed. When I asked specifically about my mail, my plants, my personal belongings. She assured me everything was secure but provided no detail. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into my stay at Sunset Manor, I was sitting in the common area when another resident mentioned seeing a moving truck at a house that sounded remarkably like mine. She described the location perfectly, talking about how sad it was to see another family lose their home. When I pressed for more details, she said it had happened several days earlier, that she'd watched from her daughter's car as furniture and boxes were loaded up and driven away. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Rebecca hadn't just committed me to care facility. She'd cleaned out my house, sold my belongings, erased 32 years of my life while I was locked away, and medicated into compliance. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, reconstructing every conversation Rebecca and I had shared over the past year and a half. I thought about the power of attorney documents, about her access to my bank accounts, about the health evaluation that had seemed designed to produce specific results. I realized that what I'd experienced wasn't a concerned daughter helping an aging parent. It was a calculated theft of my entire existence. And as the hours passed and the reality of my situation became clearer, I made a decision that would have surprised anyone who'd read my intake evaluation. I was going to fight back, not with tears or tantrums or the kind of emotional outburst they'd expect from a confused elderly woman. I was going to fight back with the one thing Rebecca had underestimated, my intelligence. Because while she'd been busy convincing everyone that I was declining and incompetent, I'd been watching, listening, and remembering. And now I had the time and motivation to piece together exactly what she'd done, how she'd done it, and most importantly, how to prove it. The next morning, I began what would become the most important investigation of my life. Not as a victim, but as a woman who'd spent 40 years teaching critical thinking and analysis, who'd raised a daughter smart enough to orchestrate an elaborate fraud, and who was about to remind Rebecca that intelligence wasn't something that disappeared just because you'd been temporarily outmaneuvered. They thought they'd buried me at Sunset Manor. Instead, they'd given me the perfect place to dig up the truth. The first step in my investigation was understanding the system I was trapped in. Sunset Manor operated on routines designed to keep residents compliant and staff efficient. Breakfast at 7, medications at 8, morning activities at 9, lunch at noon, afternoon rest period, dinner at 5, evening programming, lights out at 9. The schedule was rigid and non-negotiable, but it also provided structure I could work within. I quickly realized that the staff rotated in predictable patterns. The day shift nurses were overworked and focused on medical tasks. The evening staff was smaller and more relaxed. The night shift consisted of just 2 attendants, who spent most of their time in the break room, unless someone pressed an emergency button. This meant there were windows of opportunity when I could move around the facility without being closely monitored. My roommate Eleanor was in the late stages of dementia, and rarely spoke, but she wasn't completely unaware of her surroundings. During my second week, I discovered she'd been a bookkeeper for 40 years before her family placed her at Sunset Manor. Sometimes, in moments of clarity, she'd make comments about numbers not adding up or someone taking what wasn't theirs. I began to suspect that Eleanor had witnessed or overheard things about other residents' financial situation. One evening, while the staff was dealing with an emergency in another wing, Eleanor suddenly grabbed my wrist and whispered, "They take everything. The pretty one with the dark hair, she takes everything and they help her." When I asked what she meant, Eleanor just stared at me with eyes that seemed completely lucid, for just a moment before she drifted back into her confused state. That pretty one with dark hair could only be Rebecca, but what did Eleanor mean by they help her? And how would Eleanor know anything about my daughter's activities? I started paying closer attention to the administrative side of Sunset Manor. During meal times, I'd position myself where I could observe the main desk and the comings and goings of staff and visitors. I noticed that certain family members seemed to have longer, more private conversations with the facility director, Mrs. Harmon, than others. These weren't quick check-ins about care plans. These were meetings that took place in closed offices, with paperwork spread across desks. Rebecca fell into this category. When she did visit, she'd spend at least 20 minutes in Mrs. Harmon's office before coming to see me. She'd emerge from these meetings looking satisfied, sometimes carrying folders or documents. During our brief visits, she'd mention in passing that she was handling various financial matters for me, ensuring my care was properly funded, taking care of insurance issues and administrative details, but something about the timing bothered me. My Medicare coverage should have been straightforward, and I'd always been meticulous about keeping my insurance current. Why would there be ongoing administrative issues that required such frequent attention? And why did Rebecca seem to know more about facility operations than other family members? I decided to test something. During one of our conversations, I casually mentioned that I'd been thinking about my old neighbor Mrs. Chen, wondering how she was doing. I said I hoped Rebecca might call her for me, since I wasn't allowed to use the phones freely. Rebecca agreed readily, and said she'd take care of it the next day. Mrs. Chen had been dead for 3 years. Rebecca knew this because she'd attended the funeral with me, but she'd agreed to call a dead woman without hesitation, which meant she wasn't really listening to my requests or she didn't care enough to process what I was saying. Either way, it told me that our conversations were more performance than genuine communication. The next week I tried another test. I told Rebecca I was worried about my rose bushes, asking if she could check on them and maybe water them if they looked dry. Again, she agreed readily, but I'd never grown roses in my life. I'd always preferred wildflowers and herbs. Rebecca should have known this about the house she'd supposedly been maintaining for me. These small experiments confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. Rebecca wasn't taking care of my property or my affairs in any meaningful way. She was managing the appearance of taking care of things while pursuing some other agenda entirely. I needed information, but my access to communication was severely limited. Residents weren't allowed to use phones without staff supervision. Our internet access was restricted to supervised computer time in the activity room, and our mail was filtered through the front desk. But I'd underestimated my own resourcefulness and the resources available to someone willing to think creatively. The activity room computer was ancient and slow, but it worked. During my assigned computer time, usually Wednesday afternoons, I began researching public records and property information. The staff member supervising computer time was usually Karen, a young aide, who spent most of her attention on her phone or chatting with other staff members. As long as I appeared to be doing something harmless, like reading news or looking at weather reports, she didn't monitor my actual activity closely. I started by looking up my own property records. What I found made my stomach drop. My house had been listed for sale 6 weeks after I'd been admitted to Sunset Manor. The listing described it as an estate sale, mentioning that the owner had moved to care facility and the family was liquidating assets to fund ongoing medical expenses. The asking price was reasonable but not what the house was actually worth, suggesting they wanted a quick sale rather than maximum profit. The listing agent was someone I'd never heard of, but when I searched for their contact information, I found they specialized in estate liquidations and distressed property sales. This wasn't a normal real estate transaction. This was a fire sale designed to convert my property to cash as quickly as possible, but the most shocking discovery was the sale date. My house had sold 3 weeks ago. According to the public records, the transaction had been completed, and the deed transferred. Rebecca had sold my home, the place I'd lived for 32 years, the property that represented my life's major investment, and she'd done it while telling me she was taking care of everything. I printed the property records during my next computer session, hiding the pages in my activity folder where they'd blend in with art therapy worksheets and puzzle pages. But I needed more information about the financial aspects of the sale, and those records weren't available through the public database I could access. That's when I remembered something Eleanor had said during one of her lucid moments. She'd mentioned that families sometimes brought paperwork to sign, that residents would put their names on documents they couldn't really read or understand. At the time, I'd assumed she was talking about normal care plan updates or insurance forms. But what if it was more than that? I began observing other residents more carefully during family visits. I noticed that several of them, particularly those with dementia or limited cognitive function, would be presented with documents to sign during visits. Family members would guide their hands, help them hold pens, praise them for cooperating. The residents seemed pleased to be helpful, to be included in important family business, but I doubted any of them understood what they were signing. Was this happening to me too? I thought back to Rebecca's visits, trying to remember if she'd ever asked me to sign anything. There had been a few occasions when she'd presented papers she described as care plan updates or insurance forms, documents that supposedly needed my signature to keep my coverage current. I'd signed them without reading carefully, because I trusted her and because the staff had been present, making the transactions seem official and routine. Now I wondered what those documents had actually been. Had I unknowingly signed away more of my rights or assets? Had Rebecca been systematically obtaining my authorization for financial transactions while I was medicated and isolated? I needed to see my financial records, but I had no way to access them directly. My bank statements weren't being forwarded to me at Sunset Manor, and when I asked Rebecca about them, she said she was handling all my mail and would bring me anything important. But what Rebecca considered important, and what I needed to see might be very different things. During my next computer session, I tried to access my bank account online. I knew my account number and thought I remembered my password, but when I tried to log in, I was told that the account had been flagged for security purposes and required phone verification to access. Since I couldn't make unmonitored phone calls, this avenue was blocked, but I did have one advantage Rebecca probably hadn't considered. I'd been banking with the same institution for over 20 years, and I knew several of the employees personally. My former colleague from the college, Maria Santos, had left teaching 5 years ago to work in the bank's customer service department. If I could find a way to contact Maria without going through official channels, she might be able to help me understand what was happening with my account. The opportunity came during a group outing to the local shopping center. Once a month, Sunset Manor organized trips for residents who were considered stable and low risk. These outings were supervised but not closely monitored, especially for residents like me who'd been classified as cooperative and oriented. The staff was more concerned with preventing wandering and managing medical emergencies than monitoring every conversation. I'd signed up for the next shopping trip and planned my approach carefully. The group would be taken to a mall that included a branch of my bank. If I could separate from the group briefly and speak with someone at the bank, I might be able to gather information about my account status. The trip day arrived and I was loaded onto a small bus with 8 other residents and 2 staff members. The outing was supposed to last 3 hours, with time for shopping, lunch at the food court, and a brief walk around the mall for exercise. I waited until we reached the mall and the group dispersed into smaller clusters before making my move. I told one of the staff members that I wanted to browse in the bookstore, which was located next to the bank branch. She reminded me to stay with my assigned buddy, another resident named Frank, who was more interested in the toy store than books. I waited until Frank became distracted by a display of model trains, then slipped away toward the bank. The branch was busy with typical Saturday afternoon customers, but I recognized Maria behind one of the customer service desks. I approached casually as if I were just another bank customer rather than an elderly woman who'd escaped from a supervised outing. Maria's face lit up when she saw me. "Carol, how wonderful to see you. I heard you'd moved to one of those lovely retirement communities. How are you adjusting?" Her enthusiasm was genuine, and I realized she had no idea about my real situation. "I'm doing well," I said carefully, "but I've been having some trouble accessing my account online. Could you possibly help me check on a few things?" I provided my account information and identification, and Maria began pulling up my records on her computer. Her expression changed as she reviewed the screen. "Oh my," she said quietly. "Carol, there's been a lot of activity on your accounts recently, very large transactions. Are you aware of these transfers?" My heart began racing, but I kept my voice steady. "Could you give me some specifics? I've been having trouble keeping track of everything since the move." Maria glanced around to make sure her supervisor wasn't watching, then turned her screen slightly so I could see it. What I saw made me feel physically sick. My checking account, which had maintained a steady balance of around $15,000 for years, showed a current balance of $84. My savings account had been completely emptied. My investment account had been liquidated. Over the past 2 months, there had been dozens of large withdrawals, transfers, and closures. The activity corresponded almost exactly with my admission to Sunset Manor. Someone with power of attorney access had systematically drained my accounts while I was locked away and unable to monitor or prevent it. "Maria," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking, "I need copies of these statements. Something is very wrong here." Maria looked concerned but cautious. "Carol, I can see that your daughter Rebecca is listed as having power of attorney access on these accounts. According to our records, she's been authorized to manage your finances. But if you're concerned about unauthorized activity, we should probably talk to a manager." "No," I said quickly. "Not yet. I need to understand what's happened before I take any official action. Could you possibly print just the last 2 months of activity? I promise you, I have the right to see my own financial records." Maria hesitated, then made a decision. "Of course you do. Let me print these for you." She generated several pages of transaction history and handed them to me discreetly. "Carol, if someone is taking advantage of you, you need to report it immediately. Elder financial abuse is serious, and the bank has resources to help." I thanked Maria and tucked the papers into my purse, promising to be in touch soon. I made it back to the bookstore just as Frank was wondering where I'd gone, and we rejoined the group without anyone noticing I'd been missing. During the bus ride back to Sunset Manor, I reviewed the bank statements as discreetly as possible. The pattern was clear and devastating. Large transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, payments to companies I'd never heard of, withdrawals that corresponded to Rebecca's visits to the facility. My life savings, accumulated over decades of careful budgeting and conservative investing, had been systematically stolen while I was medicated and isolated. But the most shocking revelation was the timing of the largest transfer. The bulk of my investment account had been liquidated the day after my house sold. Rebecca hadn't just stolen my savings, she'd coordinated the theft with the sale of my property to maximize the cash she could extract from my life. I was looking at evidence of a calculated, comprehensive financial fraud perpetrated by my own daughter, and according to the legal documents I'd signed, she'd done it all with my apparent authorization. That evening, lying in my narrow bed, listening to Eleanor's labored breathing, I finally understood the full scope of what had happened to me. This wasn't just about removing an inconvenient parent or accessing an inheritance early. Rebecca had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal my entire life savings while making it appear legal and justified. She'd manipulated my doctor to create medical justification for my incompetence, convinced professionals to recommend supervised care, used my trust to gain legal authority over my finances, and then systematically liquidated everything I owned while I was locked away and unable to resist or even monitor what was happening. But Rebecca had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that placing me in a care facility would render me helpless and passive. She'd underestimated my ability to investigate, to gather evidence and to fight back, and now that I knew what she'd done, I was going to make sure she faced the consequence. The next morning, I began planning the second phase of my investigation. I had evidence of financial fraud, but I needed to understand the legal mechanisms Rebecca had used to accomplish it. I needed to know exactly which documents I'd signed, and what authority they'd given, and I needed to figure out how to challenge her actions from inside a facility where my credibility was already questioned and my communications were monitored. But I also had something Rebecca didn't expect me to have: time, motivation, and the kind of burning anger that sharpens rather than clouds judgment. She'd stolen my money, my home, and my freedom. Now I was going to steal something from her, her sense of security that she'd gotten away with it. Because while Rebecca had been busy convincing everyone that I was declining and incompetent, I'd been gathering evidence that would prove exactly the opposite. And when I was ready to present that evidence, it was going to destroy the carefully constructed lie she'd built around my supposed inability to manage my own affairs. The investigation was just beginning, and Rebecca had no idea that her supposedly confused and helpless mother was about to become the most dangerous person in her life. Armed with the bank statements that confirmed my worst suspicions, I knew I needed more than just financial records to build a solid case against Rebecca. What I had was evidence of transactions, but what I needed was proof that those transactions were unauthorized and fraudulent. The power of attorney documents I'd signed gave Rebecca legal authority to manage my finances, but only if I was truly incapacitated. If I could prove I was competent when those transactions occurred, the entire foundation of her authority would crumble. The challenge was that questioning my own competence meant challenging the professional evaluations that had landed me in Sunset Manor in the first place. I needed to understand exactly what those evaluations had concluded, and whether the conclusions were based on legitimate assessment or manipulated information. My medical files were kept in the nursing station, but they weren't accessible to residents without special circumstance. However, I'd noticed that the night shift was significantly more relaxed about protocol than the day staff. During evening hours, the nursing station was often left unattended for brief periods when staff responded to calls or took breaks. If I could time my approach correctly, I might be able to access my own records, but first I needed to create a legitimate reason to be near the nursing station during evening hours. I began complaining of mild insomnia, mentioning to the evening nurses that I was having trouble sleeping and wondered if my medication could be adjusted. This gave me a reason to approach the nursing station multiple times during the week, establishing a pattern of evening visits that wouldn't seem suspicious. During my third night of insomnia complaints, I found my opportunity. The evening nurse had been called to assist with a resident who'd fallen in the bathroom, leaving the nursing station briefly unattended. I approached the desk casually as if looking for someone to help with my sleep concerns, but quickly scanned the filing system behind the counter. Resident files were organized alphabetically and I could see the M section from where I stood. My file was thicker than most, which wasn't surprising given the extensive evaluation process Rebecca had arranged, but what I could see of the tabs suggested there were multiple sections, possibly including correspondence and evaluations from different sources. The nurse returned before I could access the files directly, but I'd learned enough about the filing system to plan my next move. I needed a longer window of opportunity and a more legitimate reason to be behind the nursing counter. The solution came from an unexpected source. During my next computer session, I'd been researching patients' rights in care facilities, when I discovered that residents had the legal right to request copies of their own medical records. The facility was required to provide them within a reasonable timeframe, though they could charge copying fees and require written requests. I submitted a formal written request for my complete medical file, including all evaluations, assessments, and correspondence related to my admission and care plan. Ms. Harmon seemed surprised by the request and mentioned that family members usually handled such administrative matters for residents. When I insisted that I wanted to review my own records, she said she'd need to verify the request with my daughter. This reaction told me something important. Ms. Harmon's first instinct was to defer to Rebecca rather than recognize my autonomous right to access my own medical information. This suggested that Rebecca had established herself as the primary decision-maker in my care, possibly to a degree that exceeded normal power of attorney arrangement. I pressed the issue, citing specific regulations about patient rights and medical record access. Mrs. Harmon became visibly uncomfortable and agreed to process my request, but mentioned that it might take several days to compile everything and that Rebecca would need to be notified as my designated healthcare proxy. The fact that Rebecca would be notified concerned me, but it also provided valuable information. If Rebecca reacted strongly to my request for medical records, it would suggest she was hiding something significant. If she tried to block my access to my own files, it would indicate that those files contained information she didn't want me to see. Rebecca's reaction was swift and revealing. She called Miss Harmon the day after my request was submitted, and I could hear raised voices from the administrative office, even though the conversation was supposedly private. Rebecca arrived at Sunset Manor that afternoon, earlier than her usual visiting time, and visibly agitated. She found me in the activity room working on a jigsaw puzzle and sat down across from me with the kind of forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, I understand you've been asking for your medical file. I'm not sure why you'd want to wade through all that technical paperwork, but if there's something specific you're concerned about, maybe I can help explain it." Her tone was patronizing, the way you'd speak to a child who was asking inappropriate questions, but her body language betrayed nervousness. She kept glancing toward the administrative offices, and her hands were restless, adjusting her jewelry and smoothing her hair. "I'd just like to understand what the doctors concluded about my condition," I said calmly. "It's my health after all." Rebecca's expression tightened slightly. "The important thing is that you're getting excellent care here. The details of the evaluation process aren't really relevant to your day-to-day well-being." This response confirmed my suspicion. Rebecca didn't want me examining the evaluations because they contained information that wouldn't withstand scrutiny. Either the conclusions were based on her misrepresentations, or the evaluation process itself had been compromised. "I'm still legally entitled to see my own medical records," I said, watching her reaction carefully. Rebecca's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine anger before she regained control. "Of course you are, Mom. I just don't want you getting confused or upset by technical language. Some of the reports are pretty detailed about cognitive decline and safety concerns." The phrase cognitive decline hit me like a slap. I'd been so focused on the financial fraud that I hadn't fully processed how Rebecca had destroyed my reputation and credibility. According to the official record, I was a woman suffering from cognitive decline who required supervised care. This wasn't just theft, it was character assassination designed to make any future accusations I made seem like the confused ramblings of an incompetent person. "What specific cognitive decline?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the fury building inside me. Rebecca hesitated, clearly not expecting me to push for details. "Well, the evaluation showed some memory issues, confusion about dates and places, difficulty with complex tasks. Nothing dramatic, but enough to indicate you needed support." This was interesting. Rebecca was describing the evaluation conclusions secondhand, as if she'd been briefed on them rather than simply present during the process. This suggested she'd been more involved in shaping the evaluation results than I'd realized. "I'd still like to see the actual reports," I said firmly. Rebecca's smile became even more strained. "I'll talk to Mrs. Harmon about expediting your request. In the meantime, try not to worry about technical details. The important thing is that you're safe and well cared for." After Rebecca left, I reflected on our conversation. Her reaction to my medical records request had revealed several important things. First, she was definitely hiding something significant in those files. Second, she was more involved in the evaluation process than she'd admitted. Third, she was actively working to prevent me from accessing information that might challenge the narrative she'd constructed about my competence. But I'd also noticed something else during our conversation. Rebecca had mentioned specific conclusions from the evaluation, details about memory issues and cognitive testing that she shouldn't have known unless she'd been extensively briefed by the evaluators or unless she'd helped shape their conclusions. The next day, Ms. Harmon informed me that my medical records request was being processed, but that there were complications. Apparently, some of the evaluations had been conducted by external specialists, and obtaining complete records would require additional time and authorization. She also mentioned that Rebecca had expressed concerns about my ability to understand the technical content, and had suggested that any records be reviewed in the presence of medical staff who could provide context and explanation. This was clearly a stalling tactic, designed to delay my access to the files while giving Rebecca time to manage the situation. But the delay also gave me time to pursue other avenues of investigation. I decided to focus on the evaluation process itself, particularly the external specialists who'd assessed my cognitive function. If I could identify who had conducted these evaluations and under what circumstances, I might be able to challenge their conclusions or uncover evidence of manipulation. During my next computer session, I researched the facility where my comprehensive evaluation had taken place. The Westfield Assessment Center specialized in geriatric evaluations, particularly for families dealing with questions about independent living and care needs. Their website emphasized thorough, objective assessments designed to ensure appropriate care planning. But as I dug deeper into their background, I found some troubling information. Several former employees had filed complaints with state regulatory agencies about pressure to reach predetermined conclusions in their evaluation. One whistleblower had specifically mentioned that certain referring parties would provide detailed background information designed to influence assessment outcomes. This suggested that the evaluation process could be manipulated, if someone provided the right kind of preliminary information to the assessor. Rebecca's careful documentation of my supposed decline, her presence at the evaluation, and her detailed responses during the assessment process could have been designed to guide the evaluators toward specific conclusions. I needed to find out exactly what information Rebecca had provided to the assessment center and how it had influenced their evaluation. But accessing those records would be even more difficult than obtaining my medical files from Sunset Manor. The solution came from an unexpected conversation with another resident's daughter. Sandra Mitchell visited her mother every Tuesday and Thursday, and I'd noticed that she seemed more skeptical about the facility's recommendations than most family members. During one of her visits, she struck up a conversation with me about the challenges of navigating eldercare decisions. Sandra mentioned that she'd had her mother evaluated at multiple facilities before deciding on Sunset Manor, and that she'd been surprised by how different the assessment conclusions were at different locations. Some evaluators had recommended immediate full-time care, while others had suggested that her mother could manage with minimal support services. This variation in assessment outcomes suggested that the evaluation process was subjective and potentially influenced by factors beyond the resident's actual condition. If I could document similar inconsistencies in my own case, it would support a challenge to the original evaluation. Sandra also mentioned something that caught my attention. She'd been charged different amounts for evaluations at different facilities, and some places had required extensive family interviews and background documentation, while others had focused primarily on direct assessment of the patient. The Westfield Assessment Center fell into the first category, requiring extensive family input and background documentation. This meant that Rebecca's influence on the evaluation process had been substantial and potentially determinative of the outcome. I asked Sandra if she'd be willing to share the contact information for the other evaluation centers she'd researched. She seemed surprised by my interest but provided several names and phone numbers, mentioning that I might want to consider getting a second opinion if I was unhappy with my current care plan. The idea of seeking a second evaluation was brilliant. If I could arrange for an independent assessment that contradicted the original Westfield conclusions, it would provide powerful evidence that the first evaluation had been compromised or inaccurate. But arranging a second evaluation from inside Sunset Manor would be challenging. I'd need Rebecca's authorization for any off-site medical appointments, and she was unlikely to approve an assessment that might challenge the conclusions that justified my current placement. I needed help from someone outside the facility, someone who could act on my behalf without Rebecca's knowledge or approval. The logical choice was a lawyer who specialized in elder law and guardianship issues, but finding and contacting such a lawyer without alerting the facility staff or Rebecca would require careful planning. During my next shopping trip, I made another strategic detour. This time I visited the public library branch in the shopping center and used their computers to research elder law attorneys in the area. I found several who specialized in guardianship disputes and elder abuse cases, including one whose website specifically mentioned experience with challenging inappropriate conservatorships and care facility placement. Attorney Patricia Valdez had extensive experience in elder rights cases and offered free initial consultations for potential clients. Her office was located about 20 minutes from Sunset Manor, and according to her website, she was willing to meet with clients in various locations if transportation was an issue. I memorized her contact information and planned my approach carefully. I couldn't call from Sunset Manor without being monitored, but I could potentially reach her office during another shopping trip or facility outing. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Sunset Manor organized a trip to a local community center for a holiday craft fair, and the event included a lunch break where residents were allowed to move around freely within the community center building. The building had public phones that residents could use for local calls. During the lunch break, while other residents were eating or browsing craft displays, I found a payphone in a quiet corridor and called Patricia Valdez's office. I explained briefly that I was a resident at an elder care facility who believed I'd been placed there inappropriately through fraudulent evaluation and financial manipulation. The receptionist connected me directly to Ms. Valdez, who listened carefully to my summary of the situation. She seemed particularly interested when I mentioned the financial transactions that had occurred after my placement and the resistance I'd encountered when trying to access my own medical records. Valdez explained that cases like mine were unfortunately not uncommon, and that proving inappropriate placement and financial abuse required careful documentation and legal strategy. She agreed to meet with me to discuss the case in detail, but warned that challenging established conservatorships and care placements was complex and time-consuming. We arranged to meet the following week during another scheduled facility outing. Valdez would position herself at a coffee shop in the shopping center where our group typically spent time, and I would find a way to speak with her privately during our visit. The meeting would need to be brief and discreet, but it would give me the opportunity to share the evidence I'd gathered and get professional legal advice about how to proceed. For the first time since my admission to Sunset Manor, I felt like I had a real chance of fighting back effectively against Rebecca's elaborate fraud. But I also knew that once I involved a lawyer, the situation would escalate quickly. Rebecca would soon discover that her supposedly helpless and confused mother was mounting a serious legal challenge to everything she'd done. The element of surprise was the only advantage I had, and I'd need to use it carefully to maximize the impact when I was ready to strike back. The night before my planned meeting with Ms. Valdez, I reviewed all the evidence I'd gathered. The bank statements showing systematic financial drainage, the property records documenting the unauthorized sale of my home, the observations about Rebecca's behavior, and the facility's deferential treatment of her, and the information about potentially compromised evaluation processes. It was a strong foundation for a legal challenge, but I knew I needed more. I needed irrefutable proof that I was competent to manage my own affairs, evidence that the original evaluation had been manipulated, and documentation that Rebecca had exceeded her legal authority under the power of attorney agreement. As I lay in my narrow bed listening to the familiar sounds of the facility at night, I realized that tomorrow's meeting with Ms. Valdez would mark the beginning of the end of my imprisonment. Rebecca had made the mistake of underestimating my intelligence, my resourcefulness, and my determination to expose her crimes. She'd stolen my money, my home, and my freedom, but she'd also given me something she hadn't intended: the time and motivation to build an airtight case against her. And now, with professional legal help, I was going to use that case to destroy the elaborate lie she'd constructed around my supposed incompetence. The investigation phase was ending. The counterattack was about to begin. The morning of my planned meeting with Patricia Valdez, I woke with a clarity and purpose I hadn't felt since before Rebecca had orchestrated my imprisonment at Sunset Manor. I dressed carefully in my best outfit, applied makeup with steady hands, and prepared mentally for what might be the most important conversation of my life. Everything I'd discovered over the past months had led to this moment, and I couldn't afford to waste the opportunity. The facility outing proceeded normally, with our small group being transported to the shopping center for what the staff described as therapeutic social interaction and light exercise. I maintained my usual demeanor, participating in casual conversation with other residents, and showing appropriate interest in the various shops and displays. Nothing about my behavior suggested that I was about to take action that would fundamentally change my circumstance. Patricia Valdez had positioned herself exactly where she'd promised, at a corner table in the coffee shop with a clear view of the main walkway. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with an alert, intelligent expression that immediately put me at ease. When I approached her table during our group's lunch break, she stood and greeted me as if we were old friends meeting for coffee. "Carol, how wonderful to see you," she said warmly, her voice carrying just the right tone of familiarity to avoid attracting attention from the facility staff. "Please, sit down. I've been looking forward to catching up." I settled into the chair across from her, and immediately felt the weight of months of frustration and determination condensing into this single conversation. "Valdez, I have limited time, but I need you to understand that everything I told you on the phone is true, and it's much worse than I initially described." She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "Tell me what's happened since we spoke." I pulled out the bank statements I'd obtained from Maria, along with the property records I'd printed during my computer sessions. As I spread the documents across the small table, I watched Miss Valdez's expression change from professional interest to genuine alarm. These transactions occurred while I was residing at the care facility, I explained quietly. My daughter has legal power of attorney, but these transfers represent the complete liquidation of my life savings and the unauthorized sale of my home. According to these records, I went from having substantial assets to being essentially destitute in a matter of weeks. Miss Valdez studied the documents carefully, occasionally making notes on a small pad. Carol, what you're showing me appears to be systematic financial elder abuse conducted under the cover of legal authority, but the key question is whether you were competent to understand and consent to these transactions when they occurred. That's exactly the problem, I said. The evaluation that resulted in my placement here was manipulated by my daughter. She provided false information to the assessors, created a fictional narrative about my declining capabilities, and guided the evaluation process to reach predetermined conclusions about my incompetence. I explained how Rebecca had gradually built a case against my mental capacity, how she'd manipulated my doctor with fabricated incidents, and how the comprehensive evaluation at Westfield Assessment Center had been influenced by her carefully crafted presentation of my supposed limitations. Valdez listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification about specific dates or details. When I finished my account, she sat back and considered the information for a moment before responding. What you're describing is a sophisticated fraud that exploits the legal mechanisms designed to protect vulnerable elderly people, she said. Your daughter essentially weaponized the guardianship and power of attorney system to steal your assets while making it appear legal and justified. Can we challenge it? I asked directly. We can absolutely challenge it, but we need to be strategic about how we proceed. The first step is obtaining an independent cognitive evaluation that demonstrates your competence. If we can prove you were capable of managing your own affairs when these transactions occurred, we can argue that your daughter exceeded her legal authority. Ms. Valdez explained that she'd worked with several geriatric psychiatrists who specialized in competency evaluations and were experienced in identifying cases where previous assessments had been compromised or inaccurate. She could arrange for such an evaluation to be conducted confidentially, without alerting Rebecca or the facility staff. The second component is challenging the financial transactions themselves, she continued. Even with power of attorney, your daughter had a fiduciary duty to act in your best interest. Liquidating your entire estate to fund care that may have been unnecessary or inappropriate could constitute a violation of that duty. She also mentioned that the rapid sale of my house at below market value could be challenged as a breach of fiduciary responsibility, particularly if Rebecca had personally benefited from the transaction or had failed to explore alternative funding options for my care. How long will this process take? I asked, conscious that my time away from the group was limited. That depends on several factors, including how cooperative your daughter is when we confront her with the evidence and whether she's willing to negotiate a settlement. If she fights the charges, we could be looking at months of litigation, but in the meantime, we can seek emergency court orders to freeze any remaining assets and potentially halt inappropriate care arrangements. Miss Valdez handed me her business card and a small note. I want you to document everything you can remember about the evaluation process, your daughter's visits, and any conversations you've had with facility staff about your care plan. The more detailed information we have, the stronger our case will be. She also provided me with the contact information for Dr. Sarah Chen, the geriatric psychiatrist who would conduct my independent evaluation. Dr. Chen can arrange to meet with you during one of your facility outings, similar to how we're meeting today. The evaluation will be thorough but discreet. We arranged for Dr. Chen to contact me during my next computer session at Sunset Manor, using an encrypted email system that would allow us to coordinate the evaluation without involving facility staff or alerting Rebecca to what was happening. As our meeting concluded, Miss Valdez looked directly into my eyes and said something that gave me hope for the first time in months. Carol, what's been done to you is unconscionable, but it's not irreversible. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win. I returned to the facility group just as they were preparing to leave the shopping center, no one had noticed my absence, and I spent the bus ride back to Sunset Manor feeling energized and determined in a way I hadn't experienced since before my admission. Over the next week, I followed Ms. Valdez's instructions meticulously. I documented every detail I could remember about Rebecca's manipulation of the evaluation process, the timing of financial transactions, and the facility's treatment of me as an incompetent person rather than a legal adult with rights and autonomy. Dr. Chen contacted me through the secure email system during my next computer session, and we arranged to meet during a scheduled outing to a local museum. Like Valdez, she positioned herself as a casual acquaintance, and we spent 2 hours in detailed conversation about my mental status, my understanding of recent events, and my capacity to make informed decisions about my care and finances. Chen's evaluation was comprehensive but respectful, treating me as an intelligent adult rather than a potentially impaired elderly person. She administered cognitive tests, discussed complex scenarios, and evaluated my ability to understand consequences and make reasoned judgment. At the end of our session, Dr. Chen's assessment was unambiguous. Carol, based on this evaluation, you demonstrate full cognitive capacity and decision-making ability. Any previous assessment that concluded otherwise was either conducted improperly or based on inaccurate information. She explained that she would prepare a detailed report documenting my competence, which could be used to challenge the authority under which Rebecca had been acting, and the appropriateness of my placement at Sunset Manor. Armed with this independent evaluation and the evidence I'd gathered about the financial fraud, Miss Valdez was ready to take action. She filed a petition with the probate court challenging Rebecca's authority under the power of attorney, requesting an emergency hearing to review my placement, and seeking the appointment of an independent guardian to oversee my affairs until the legal issues could be resolved. The legal filing triggered a series of events that unfolded with surprising speed. Rebecca was served with court papers demanding that she account for all financial transactions she'd conducted on my behalf, and appear at a hearing to justify her actions. Rebecca's reaction was swift and desperate. She arrived at Sunset Manor the day after being served, visibly agitated and demanding to speak with me privately. Miss Harmon informed her that I was in the activity room, and Rebecca found me working on a crossword puzzle, maintaining the appearance of a confused elderly woman engaged in simple mental stimulation. "Mom, we need to talk," Rebecca said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Someone has been asking questions about your finances, and there seems to be some confusion about the arrangements we made for your care." I looked up at her with what I hoped appeared to be mild confusion. "What kind of questions do you—" Rebecca sat down across from me, her eyes darting around the room to make sure we weren't being overheard. "A lawyer has been making inquiries about your accounts and the sale of your house. I think someone might be trying to take advantage of you, maybe claiming they can get you better care or something like that." It was fascinating to watch Rebecca scramble to control the narrative even as her carefully constructed fraud was beginning to unravel. She was trying to position herself as my protector against unknown threats, hoping to maintain my confidence and cooperation. "I don't understand," I said, maintaining my confused elderly woman act. "Haven't you been taking care of everything for me?" "Of course I have," Rebecca said, quickly. "But now there are people questioning the decisions we made together, claiming that I didn't have the right to help you manage your finances or arrange for your care here." She leaned closer, her voice becoming more urgent. "Mom, if anyone asks you questions about our arrangements, you need to tell them that you asked me to handle everything, that you wanted me to sell the house and manage your money. Can you remember that?" This request revealed the fundamental weakness in Rebecca's position. Despite all the legal documentation she'd assembled, she was still vulnerable if I contradicted her narrative about my wishes and consent. She needed me to continue playing the role of a grateful, confused mother who had willingly surrendered control of her life. "I think so," I said, uncertain. "But Rebecca, I've been wondering about something. When will I be able to go home?" Rebecca's expression hardened for just a moment, before she forced another smile. "Mom, you know you can't live alone anymore. The doctors were very clear about that. This is your home now and you're much safer here." "But I miss my garden," I said plaintively, "and my books. Could I at least visit the house to see how the new owners are taking care of my roses?" Rebecca's composure cracked completely, The house is gone, Mom. We talked about this. We had to sell it to pay for your care here. There's no going back. The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. She was discussing the destruction of my life with the same tone she might use to explain why a broken toy couldn't be fixed. In that moment, any remaining doubt I had about the righteousness of my legal challenge disappeared completely. I don't remember agreeing to sell the house, I said, allowing genuine confusion to color my voice. Rebecca's eyes flashed with something that looked like panic mixed with anger. You have to remember, Mom, we discussed it extensively. You signed all the papers yourself, did I asked. I don't recall signing anything about selling the house. Rebecca stood abruptly, her professional composure completely abandoned. This conversation is exactly why you need supervised care. You can't remember important decisions from just a few months ago. What if that lawyer tries to confuse you with questions you can't answer properly? She was inadvertently making my case for me. Rebecca's reaction to my claimed memory problems revealed that she was terrified of what I might say under questioning. If my placement was truly appropriate, and her financial management was truly authorized, she wouldn't be so concerned about my testimony. Rebecca, I said, looking directly into her eyes, who is this lawyer you're worried about? She hesitated, clearly debating how much information to share. Someone named Patricia Valdez. She's been making inquiries about your accounts and asking questions about the evaluation process. She might try to contact you directly, and if she does, you need to refuse to speak with her without me present. This instruction violated my basic rights as a legal adult, but Rebecca was too panicked to realize how her demand sounded. She was essentially admitting that she wanted to prevent me from exercising my right to legal counsel. Why can't I talk to her? I asked, innocently. Because she doesn't understand your situation, Rebecca said quickly. She might try to convince you that I've done something wrong, when really I've been protecting you and making sure you get the care you need. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Harmon, who approached our table with an expression of professional concern. Rebecca, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development regarding your mother's care that we need to discuss. Rebecca's face went pale. What kind of development? Miss Harmon glanced at me, then back at Rebecca. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office. Rebecca started to agree, then seemed to remember my presence. Mom, why don't you continue with your puzzle while Mrs. Harmon and I take care of some administrative detail? But I was done playing the compliant, confused elderly woman. I stood up and looked directly at Mrs. Harmon. I'd like to participate in any discussion about my care. These are my affairs, and I have the right to be informed about decisions that affect me. Mrs. Harmon looked surprised by my assertive tone, and Rebecca's expression shifted from panic to something approaching terror. For the first time since my admission to Sunset Manor, I was speaking and acting like the competent, intelligent woman I'd always been. Of course, Mrs. Martinez, Mrs. Harmon said carefully, you absolutely have the right to be involved in discussions about your care. The three of us walked to Mrs. Harmon's office, and I could feel Rebecca's growing desperation with each step. The legal papers had been served, the questions were being asked, and her supposedly helpless mother was suddenly demanding to be treated as a competent adult. In Miss Harmon's office, we learned that the court had issued a temporary restraining order freezing all financial transactions related to my accounts pending the outcome of the competency hearing. Additionally, the court had appointed an independent advocate to review my current placement and ensure that my rights were being protected during the legal proceedings. Rebecca's face went through a series of expressions as Mrs. Harmon explained the court order: shock, anger, fear, and finally a kind of calculating desperation as she realized that her elaborate fraud was unraveling rapidly. This is ridiculous, Rebecca said, her voice rising. My mother is clearly not competent to manage her own affairs. Look at her living situation before I intervened. She was isolated, confused, unable to maintain her property or handle basic financial tasks. I decided it was time to drop the pretense completely. Rebecca, I was never confused or unable to manage my affairs. I was successfully living independently, teaching part-time, and maintaining my home perfectly well, until you manipulated the evaluation process to create a false narrative about my competence. The silence in the room was absolute. Miss Harmon stared at me in shock, clearly reevaluating everything she thought she knew about my mental status. Rebecca's face had gone completely white. Furthermore, I continued, I never gave you permission to sell my house, liquidate my investment accounts, or place me in this facility against my will. Everything you've done has been without my informed consent and in violation of your fiduciary duty. Rebecca tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. I have copies of all the financial transactions you conducted while I was imprisoned here. I have evidence of the lies you told to medical professionals to manipulate the evaluation process, and I have an independent competency evaluation that proves I was fully capable of managing my own affairs when you decided to steal my life savings. Miss Harmon was frantically taking notes, clearly realizing that Sunset Manor might be legally liable for participating in what appeared to be an elaborate elder abuse scheme. Rebecca made one final desperate attempt to regain control. Mom, you're having one of your episodes. This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that made it clear you needed supervised care. I smiled at her, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. Rebecca, the only episode I'm having is an episode of clarity about what you've done to me, and now everyone else is going to have that same clarity. The confrontation continued for another hour as Mrs. Harmon tried to understand the scope of the situation, and Rebecca desperately attempted to maintain her narrative of concerned daughter protecting an incompetent mother. But the damage was done. The legal process was in motion, the evidence was mounting, and Rebecca's carefully constructed fraud was collapsing under scrutiny. As we left Mrs. Harmon's office, Rebecca made one last attempt to intimidate me into silence. Mom, if you continue with this ridiculous legal action, you're going to destroy our family. The boys will learn that their grandmother is making terrible accusations against their mother. Is that what you want? I stopped walking and turned to face her directly. Rebecca, you destroyed our family the moment you decided to steal my life savings and imprison me in this facility. The boys will learn the truth eventually, and when they do, they'll understand that their mother is a criminal who betrayed her own parent for money. Rebecca's composure finally cracked completely. You ungrateful, selfish woman, she hissed. I gave up years of my life taking care of you, and this is how you repay me. You didn't take care of me, I replied calmly. You took care of yourself to my money. And now you're going to face the consequences. That was the last conversation I ever had with my daughter as her victim. From that point forward, Rebecca would have to deal with me as her legal adversary, and she was about to discover that I was far more formidable in that role than she'd ever imagined. The weeks following my confrontation with Rebecca moved with the relentless momentum of justice finally set in motion. Patricia Valdez had filed comprehensive legal documents that painted a devastating picture of systematic elder abuse, financial fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. The court response was swift and decisive, reflecting the serious nature of the allegations and the compelling evidence we'd assembled. Within 72 hours of the initial filing, I was moved from Sunset Manor to a transitional living facility that specialized in serving elderly clients who were awaiting resolution of legal disputes about their care arrangement. Unlike Sunset Manor, this facility treated me as a competent adult who happened to be temporarily displaced, rather than as an impaired person, requiring constant supervision. The difference in treatment was so stark it felt like emerging from a fog I hadn't realized I'd been living in. The new facility, Riverside Transitional Care, operated more like an extended stay hotel than a nursing home. I had my own apartment with a kitchenette, private bathroom, and sitting. There were communal dining options if I wanted them, but I could also prepare my own meals and come and go as I pleased within reasonable safety guidelines. Most importantly, I had unrestricted access to phone, internet, and mail, which allowed me to participate fully in my legal case and begin the process of rebuilding my life. Rebecca's legal response was as predictable as it was desperate. Her attorney filed counter motions claiming that I was suffering from advanced dementia with periods of apparent lucidity that masked severe underlying cognitive impairment. They argued that my sudden display of assertiveness and clarity was actually a symptom of my condition, rather than evidence of competence, and that my accusations against Rebecca were paranoid delusions typical of elderly people experiencing cognitive decline. This strategy required them to explain away Dr. Chen's independent evaluation, which had comprehensively documented my mental acuity and decision-making capacity. Rebecca's legal team hired their own geriatric psychiatrist to review Dr. Chen's findings and challenge her methodology. They also demanded a court-ordered evaluation by a neutral third-party expert to resolve the conflicting assessments of my mental status. I welcomed this development because I was confident that any legitimate evaluation would confirm my competence. More importantly, the court-ordered assessment would be conducted under strict judicial oversight, making it impossible for Rebecca to manipulate the process as she had done with the original Westfield evaluation. During this period, Patricia Valdez was working tirelessly to trace the full extent of Rebecca's financial fraud. What we discovered exceeded even my worst expectations about the scope of her betrayal. Rebecca hadn't simply liquidated my known assets and sold my house. She'd systematically looted every financial resource I possessed while simultaneously running up substantial debts in my name. The forensic accounting revealed that Rebecca had used her power of attorney to take out a reverse mortgage on my house before selling it, essentially borrowing against the property's value and then pocketing both the loan proceeds and the sale price. She'd liquidated my retirement accounts, cashed in life insurance policies, and sold valuable personal property including jewelry and artwork that had been in my family for generations. But perhaps most shocking was the discovery that Rebecca had been billing my accounts for supposed caregiving services she'd never actually provided. Over the course of 18 months, she'd submitted invoices totaling more than $60,000 for home health aid services, medical equipment, specialized transportation, and other care-related expenses that were completely fictional. She'd created an elaborate paper trail of false documentation to support these fraudulent billing claims. The total amount of money Rebecca had stolen exceeded $400,000, representing virtually my entire life savings and the value of assets I'd accumulated over decades of careful financial planning. She'd left me with less than $2,000 in accessible funds, while simultaneously placing me in an expensive care facility that would have depleted even those remaining resources within a matter of months. Patricia explained that this level of systematic theft went far beyond typical power of attorney abuse. Rebecca had essentially created a criminal enterprise designed to strip me of every asset I possessed while making the theft appear legitimate through fraudulent documentation and manipulation of the legal system. The criminal implications of Rebecca's actions became clear when the district attorney's office announced they were opening a formal investigation into elder abuse and financial fraud charges. Rebecca was facing potential felony convictions that could result in substantial prison time, particularly given the premeditated nature of her crimes and the vulnerability of her victim. Rebecca's response to the escalating legal pressure was to double down on her narrative of concerned daughter protecting an incompetent mother. She gave interviews to local media outlets, tearfully describing her heartbreak at being accused of crimes by a mother who could no longer distinguish reality from paranoid fantasy. She painted herself as a devoted caregiver who had sacrificed her own financial security to ensure I received proper medical attention and supervision. These media appearances backfired spectacularly when Patricia released portions of the forensic accounting that documented the fraudulent billing and systematic asset liquidation. The contrast between Rebecca's public claims of financial sacrifice and the evidence of her substantial personal enrichment from my resources made her appear calculating and dishonest rather than sympathetic. The court-ordered competency evaluation took place 6 weeks after my confrontation at Sunset Manor, conducted by Dr. Michael Reyes, a highly respected geriatric psychiatrist with extensive experience in legal competency assessment. The evaluation was comprehensive, lasting 2 full days and including not only cognitive testing but also detailed interviews about my life history, financial knowledge, and understanding of the legal proceedings. Dr. Reyes's conclusions were unambiguous and devastating to Rebecca's case. His report stated that I demonstrated full cognitive capacity, sophisticated understanding of complex financial and legal concepts, and clear insight into the circumstances that had led to my inappropriate placement in supervised care. He specifically noted that my ability to gather evidence, coordinate legal representation and articulate my situation demonstrated the kind of executive functioning that would be impossible for someone with significant cognitive impairment. More damaging to Rebecca's position was Dr. Reyes's analysis of the original Westfield Assessment Center evaluation. After reviewing the documentation from that assessment, he concluded that the evaluation had been compromised by unreliable third-party information and had failed to follow standard protocols for distinguishing between actual cognitive impairment and situational factors that might temporarily affect performance. Reyes noted that the Westfield evaluation had placed excessive weight on family member reports of concerning behavior while failing to adequately verify those reports through independent observation or corroborating evidence. He characterized the assessment as procedurally flawed and diagnostically unreliable and recommended that its conclusions be disregarded entirely. Armed with this expert validation of my competence, Patricia moved for summary judgment on the central questions of my legal capacity and Rebecca's authority to act on my behalf. The court agreed to expedite the hearing given the ongoing financial implications and the potential for additional asset dissipation while the case remained unresolved. The hearing took place on a gray February morning in a courthouse that had become as familiar to me as my former neighborhood. I arrived early with Patricia, dressed in my best professional attire and carrying the comprehensive documentation we'd assembled over months of investigation. For the first time in nearly a year, I felt like I was walking into a situation where I had power rather than being powerless. Rebecca appeared with her legal team looking haggard and desperate. The confident, polished woman who had orchestrated my imprisonment had been replaced by someone who looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. The stress of facing serious criminal charges while trying to maintain her professional reputation and family relationships was clearly taking its toll. The hearing began with Dr. Reyes presenting his competency evaluation, methodically destroying every element of Rebecca's claim that I was mentally incapacitated. His testimony was clinical and objective, but the implications were devastating for Rebecca's defense. When her attorney attempted to challenge his findings through cross-examination, Dr. Reyes calmly dismantled each criticism with reference to specific test results and established diagnostic criteria. Patricia then presented the forensic accounting evidence, walking through each fraudulent transaction and documenting the systematic nature of Rebecca's theft. The judge's expressions grew increasingly stern as the scope of the financial abuse became clear. When Patricia showed the court documentation of Rebecca's fictional billing for caregiving services, the judge interrupted to ask whether criminal referrals had been made. Rebecca's attorney attempted to argue that the financial transactions had been necessary to fund my care and that any irregularities were the result of the complex administrative requirements of managing elderly care rather than intentional fraud. This argument collapsed when Patricia demonstrated that the majority of the stolen funds had been deposited into Rebecca's personal accounts, rather than being used for any care-related expenses. The most dramatic moment of the hearing came when I was called to testify about my experience. Standing at the witness stand, looking directly at Rebecca for the first time since our confrontation at Sunset Manor, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been absent from my life for too long. Patricia guided me through my testimony, starting with my life before Rebecca's intervention and progressing through the systematic manipulation and abuse I'd experienced. I described in detail how Rebecca had created false narratives about my competence, manipulated medical evaluations, and used my trust to gain access to my financial resources. When I testified about discovering the extent of her theft, about realizing that she'd sold my home and liquidated my life savings while keeping me imprisoned and medicated, I saw something in Rebecca's face that I'd never seen before, not anger or desperation, but what looked like genuine shame. For just a moment, the daughter I'd raised seemed to resurface. Horrified by what she'd become, Rebecca's attorney cross-examined me aggressively, trying to highlight inconsistencies in my memory or evidence of confusion that might support their incompetence claim. But months of investigation and preparation had sharpened my recollection of events, and I was able to respond to each challenge with specific details and corroborating evidence. When the attorney suggested that my accusations against Rebecca were motivated by ingratitude for her caregiving efforts, I looked directly at the judge and said, "Your Honor, theft is not caregiving, imprisonment is not protection, and lying to medical professionals to manufacture evidence of incompetence is not love." What my daughter did to me was calculated criminal abuse, and the evidence speaks for itself. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and unequivocal. He found that I was fully competent and had been competent throughout the period when Rebecca claimed to be acting on my behalf. He invalidated all financial transactions Rebecca had conducted without my informed consent, and ordered the immediate return of all stolen assets that could be recovered. More significantly, the judge referred Rebecca's case to the district attorney with a strong recommendation for criminal prosecution. He characterized her actions as a sophisticated and premeditated scheme to defraud an elderly parent through abuse of legal authority and manipulation of medical professionals. The judge also ordered Rebecca to pay substantial damages, including restitution for stolen assets, punitive damages for the emotional harm she'd caused, and attorney fees for the legal costs of challenging her fraud. The total judgment exceeded $600,000, reflecting not only the money she'd stolen but also the additional costs and consequences of her crime. But the most satisfying element of the judgment was the court's order that Rebecca be permanently barred from any involvement in my financial or medical affairs. The judge noted that her abuse of power of attorney authority demonstrated a fundamental breach of trust that could never be repaired, regardless of any family relationship. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of vindication and relief that was almost overwhelming. After months of being treated as an incompetent victim, I'd proven that I was not only capable of defending myself, but also smart enough to gather the evidence necessary to destroy the elaborate fraud that had nearly cost me everything. But even as I celebrated this legal victory, I knew that rebuilding my life would be a long and complex process. Rebecca had stolen more than just money. She'd taken my home, my sense of security, and my trust in the people closest to me. The financial resources could potentially be recovered, but the emotional damage would take much longer to heal. The media coverage of the case was extensive, with several news outlets describing it as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of elderly people to financial abuse by family members. Patricia used the publicity to advocate for stronger legal protections for elderly adults and better training for medical professionals about recognizing signs of manipulation and family dynamics. Rebecca's criminal trial took place 4 months later, and the prosecution's case was even more damning than the civil proceedings had been. Additional evidence had emerged showing that Rebecca had researched elder abuse techniques online, and had specifically studied how to manipulate competency evaluations to achieve desired outcomes. The prosecution also revealed that Rebecca had attempted to destroy evidence after learning about my legal challenge, including deleting computer files and shredding documents related to her fraudulent activities. This evidence of obstruction of justice added additional charges and demonstrated consciousness of guilt that undermined any remaining sympathy for her position. Rebecca ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges including elder abuse, financial fraud, and identity theft. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, and ordered to pay full restitution for the money she'd stolen. The judge noted during sentencing that Rebecca's abuse of her position as my daughter made her crimes particularly egregious and warranted a substantial punishment to deter similar abuse by other family members. The criminal conviction also triggered professional consequences for Rebecca, who lost her business license and was permanently barred from working in financial consulting. Her career, built on a reputation for trustworthiness and ethical behavior, was destroyed by the revelation that she'd been stealing from her own mother while claiming to protect her wealth. During the months between the civil judgment and Rebecca's criminal sentencing, I focused on rebuilding my life and establishing new routines that would help me move forward from the trauma of her betrayal. With Patricia's help, I was able to recover a substantial portion of the stolen money. Though some assets had been dissipated beyond recovery, I used part of the recovered funds to purchase a new home, smaller than my previous house, but comfortable and suited to my current needs. I returned to teaching part-time at the community college, finding that my experiences had given me new insights into resilience and advocacy that enriched my interactions with students. But perhaps most importantly, I established new relationships with people who respected my autonomy and competence, rather than viewing me as someone to be managed or protected. The support network I built included other elder abuse survivors,
legal advocates, and younger people who valued the wisdom and experience I could offer. I also became involved in advocacy work aimed at preventing the kind of abuse I'd experienced. Working with organizations that supported elderly victims of financial crimes, I helped develop educational materials about recognizing manipulation tactics and protecting against power of attorney abuse. The most difficult aspect of rebuilding my life was accepting that my relationship with Rebecca was permanently damaged. Despite everything she'd done, part of me had hoped that facing consequences for her actions might lead to genuine remorse and some possibility of reconciliation. But Rebecca's behavior throughout the legal proceedings had shown me that she viewed herself as the victim of an ungrateful mother rather than as a criminal who had betrayed her own family.
The most devastating revelation was that David had known about the fraudulent billing for caregiving services. Rebecca had told him she was documenting all the time she spent managing my affairs so that the family could be compensated for their efforts from my estate. David had helped her create false receipts and invoices to support these fraudulent claims. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked when he finally finished his confession. David was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because the boys have been asking questions about their mother's conviction, and I realized I couldn't keep lying to them. They're old enough to understand that stealing is wrong, regardless of the justification, and they're old enough to know that their grandmother isn't the villain in this story." He explained that Rebecca's imprisonment had forced him to confront the reality of what they'd done and the impact it had had on everyone involved. Watching the boys struggle with their mother's absence while still believing she'd been wrongfully convicted had made him realize that the lies needed to stop. "I want to bring the boys to see you again," David said. "But this time, I want to tell them the truth about what happened. They deserve to know that their grandmother is a strong, intelligent woman who stood up for herself when her own daughter tried to steal from her." This offer of honesty and potential reconciliation was more than I'd dared to hope for. The possibility of rebuilding a relationship with my grandsons based on truth rather than manipulation felt like a gift I hadn't expected to receive. Over the following months, David gradually helped the boys understand the real story of what had happened between Rebecca and me. It was a difficult process, requiring age-appropriate explanations of complex legal and financial concepts, but the boys were intelligent and ultimately able to grasp that their mother had done serious wrong. The first visit with my grandsons after David's confession was awkward and tentative, but it marked the beginning of a slow rebuilding process. As the boys learned more about the case and began to understand that I wasn't responsible for their family's problems, they started to warm up to the idea of having a relationship with me again. These visits became regular occurrences, and I found myself once again able to enjoy my role as a grandmother. The boys were curious about my experiences and impressed by my determination to fight back against injustice. What had started as a story of family betrayal gradually transformed into a lesson about resilience and the importance of standing up for yourself. David also surprised me by offering to help with restitution for some of the non-monetary losses I'd suffered. He couldn't return the sentimental items that Rebecca had sold, but he was able to locate and purchase back some family photographs and documents that had been included in estate sale lot. These gestures of accountability and repair couldn't undo the damage Rebecca had caused, but they represented a form of justice that the legal system alone couldn't provide. David's willingness to acknowledge his complicity and work toward making amends showed me that healing was possible even in the aftermath of profound betrayal. Rebecca herself remained unrepentant throughout her incarceration. The few communications I received from her were focused on maintaining her narrative of victimhood and expressing anger about the consequences she was facing. She continued to insist that she'd acted in my best interests and that the criminal charges were the result of my vindictiveness rather than her criminal behavior. But Rebecca's refusal to accept responsibility no longer had the power to hurt me the way it once had. I'd proven to myself and to the world that I was capable of defending my rights and exposing injustice. Her denial couldn't diminish the fact that justice had been served and that I'd successfully rebuilt my life on my own terms. As I reflect on the entire experience now, nearly 2 years after walking out of that courthouse with my vindication secured, I realized that Rebecca's betrayal, while devastating, ultimately revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. Being forced to investigate, advocate, and fight for myself taught me that age doesn't automatically mean powerlessness, and that intelligence and determination can overcome even the most sophisticated forms of abuse. I've used these lessons to help other elderly people who faced similar betrayals, working with legal advocates and support organizations to ensure that other victims have access to the resources and knowledge they need to fight back. My story has become part of educational materials used to train medical professionals, legal workers, and family members about recognizing and preventing elder abuse. The financial recovery from Rebecca's restitution payments allowed me to establish a comfortable and secure lifestyle, but more importantly, the experience gave me a sense of purpose and empowerment that money alone could never provide. I'd faced down a sophisticated criminal conspiracy and emerged victorious through my own efforts and intelligence. My relationship with my grandsons continues to grow stronger as they mature and gain a deeper understanding of the complexity of adult relationships and moral choices. They've become advocates themselves, speaking to their classmates about elder abuse prevention and the importance of treating elderly family members with respect and dignity. Looking back, I realized that Rebecca's greatest miscalculation was underestimating not just my intelligence, but my capacity for growth and adaptation under pressure. She saw an aging woman who could be easily manipulated and controlled, but what she got was a determined adversary who refused to accept injustice quietly. The woman who walked out of that courthouse after Rebecca's conviction was stronger, wiser, and more confident than the woman who'd been manipulated into signing power of attorney documents 2 years earlier. Rebecca had intended to diminish me, but instead, her crimes had revealed capabilities I'd never been forced to use before. Today, I live independently in my comfortable new home, surrounded by books, plants, and photographs that represent the life I've rebuilt rather than the one that was stolen from me. I teach, I advocate, I mentor other abuse survivors, and I maintain relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation or control. Rebecca will be released from prison in 18 months, and I have no illusions that she'll emerge with any greater understanding of the harm she caused. But her release no longer frightens me, because I know now that I'm capable of protecting myself and that I have the support of people who respect my autonomy and competence. The ultimate irony of Rebecca's scheme is that in trying to render me powerless, she forced me to discover just how powerful I actually was. She thought she was putting me in financial care, but instead, she put herself directly in the path of a woman who refused to go quietly into the shadow. And now everyone who hears this story knows exactly what happens when you underestimate the determination of someone who's spent a lifetime building the wisdom and strength to fight back. The months following Rebecca's release from prison brought unexpected developments that would test everything I'd learned about resilience and forgiveness. I'd thought the hardest part of this journey was behind me, but Rebecca's return to society introduced new challenges that forced me to confront questions I hadn't anticipated. Rebecca served 3 years and 2 months of her 4-year sentence, earning early release for good behavior and participation in prison rehabilitation program. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd received credit for being a model prisoner while showing no genuine remorse for the crimes that had landed her there in the first place. David had kept me informed about Rebecca's status throughout her incarceration, not because I'd asked for updates, but because he felt I deserved to know when she'd be returning to the community. His transformation from enabler to ally had been one of the few positive outcomes of this entire ordeal, and his commitment to transparency had helped rebuild trust between our family. The first sign that Rebecca's release would complicate my carefully rebuilt life came in the form of a letter delivered to my home 3 days before she was scheduled to be released. The envelope bore the return address of the correctional facility, and inside was a handwritten note that made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Rebecca's letter was brief but loaded with implications that immediately put me on guard. She wrote that her time in prison had given her perspective on our family situation, and that she hoped we could find a way to move forward constructively for the sake of the grandchildren. She mentioned that she'd been participating in therapy and financial counseling programs that had helped her understand the impact of her actions. But what concerned me most was her final paragraph, where she expressed hope that we could discuss mutually beneficial arrangements that would allow our family to heal while respecting everyone's legitimate interest. The phrase mutually beneficial arrangements sounded ominously like the kind of manipulative language Rebecca had used before, suggesting that she viewed her release as an opportunity to negotiate rather than simply accept the consequences of her crime. I shared the letter with Patricia Valdez, who remained my attorney even though the criminal case had concluded years earlier. Patricia's reaction mirrored my own concerns about Rebecca's apparent belief that she was in a position to propose arrangements or negotiations with me. Carol, this letter suggests that Rebecca still doesn't understand that she has no standing to request anything from you, Patricia said during our meeting. Her conviction in the civil judgment resolved all legal questions about your relationship. She's not entitled to contact with you, access to your finances, or any role in your life unless you choose to allow it. Patricia reminded me that the restraining orders that had been part of Rebecca's sentencing remained in effect, prohibiting her from contacting me directly or attempting to influence my financial decision. The letter itself technically violated those orders, though proving prosecutorial intent would be difficult given its superficially conciliatory tone. We decided to document the letter and send a formal response through Patricia's office, clearly stating that I had no interest in any arrangements or negotiations with Rebecca and that further contact should be directed through legal channels. Patricia also reached out to Rebecca's parole officer to ensure that the contact restrictions were clearly understood and would be enforced. Rebecca's response to our formal rejection of her overtures was swift and revealing. Within a week of her release, I began receiving phone calls from people I hadn't heard from in years, friends and acquaintances who mentioned that Rebecca had been in touch with them about my well-being and our family situation. These contacts followed a disturbing pattern. Rebecca would reach out to mutual friends or distant relatives, expressing concern about my isolation and suggesting that I might be under the influence of manipulative advisors who were keeping me from reconciling with my family. She painted herself as a reformed person seeking to make amends while portraying me as someone being exploited by lawyers and advocates who had their own financial interests in maintaining family discord. This campaign was sophisticated and insidious, designed to create social pressure for reconciliation while avoiding direct contact that would violate her parole condition. Rebecca was essentially trying to weaponize our social network to force me into a position where refusing to engage with her would make me appear unreasonable or vindictive. One of these intermediary contacts came from my former colleague at the community college, Dr. Margaret Chen, who called to express concern about what she'd heard from Rebecca about my current living situation. According to Rebecca's account, I was living in isolation, being financially exploited by legal advisors, and suffering from the kind of depression and paranoia that often affected elderly crime victims. Carol, I hope you don't mind my calling, Margaret said carefully, but Rebecca seemed genuinely concerned about your well-being. She mentioned that you've cut yourself off from family and that some people might be taking advantage of your situation for their own benefit. I explained to Margaret the reality of my situation, the facts about Rebecca's crimes, and the truth about my current life, which was actually fuller and more satisfying than it had been in years. But I could hear the uncertainty in Margaret's voice as she tried to reconcile Rebecca's convincing presentation of concern with the documented evidence of her criminal behavior. This interaction revealed how effectively Rebecca was exploiting the natural human tendency to assume that family reconciliation is inherently positive, and that holding grudges against relatives is ultimately self-destructive. She was counting on people's discomfort with permanent family estrangement to pressure me into giving her another chance, regardless of the severity of her previous betrayal. Patricia advised me to address this social manipulation campaign directly by proactively reaching out to key people in my network to provide them with accurate information about my circumstances and Rebecca's continued attempts to manipulate the situation. This preemptive communication helped inoculate my friends and colleagues against Rebecca's influence while demonstrating that I was functioning independently and making my own decisions. But the most troubling development came when David called to inform me that Rebecca had been attempting to re-establish contact with her sons, my grandsons, who were now 14 and 16 years old. Her parole conditions allowed supervised visitation with her children, but she was using these visits to pump them for information about my life and to plant seeds of doubt about the narrative they'd come to understand about her crime. She's telling them that the legal system was unfair to her, that the evidence was exaggerated, and that you could have prevented her prosecution if you'd really wanted to. David explained during a tense phone conversation. The boys are confused because they've gotten used to having a relationship with you again, but now their mother is making them feel guilty about that loyalty. This revelation was particularly painful because my relationship with my grandsons had become one of the most meaningful aspects of my rebuilt life. Watching them mature and develop their own sense of justice and integrity had given me hope that the next generation would be better equipped to recognize and resist manipulation. Now Rebecca was using her maternal influence to undermine that progress. David was struggling with his own conflicted feelings about how to handle Rebecca's return. As the father of her children, he couldn't completely cut her out of their lives, but he also recognized that her continued manipulation was harmful to everyone involved. He'd hoped that prison might have genuinely changed her perspective, but her behavior since release suggested that she'd simply learned to be more subtle in her approach. I decided to address the situation with my grandsons directly, asking David to arrange a conversation where I could explain my position clearly without competing with Rebecca's influence. The three of us met at a restaurant where we could talk privately, and I was struck by how much the boys had matured during the years since their mother's conviction. I want you both to understand something important about the situation with your mother, I began carefully. My decision not to have a relationship with her isn't about revenge or being unable to forgive. It's about protecting myself from someone who has shown repeatedly that she can't be trusted to respect my rights or well-being. The older boy, Marcus, who was now 16 and quite thoughtful, asked a question that surprised me with its sophistication. Grandma, do you think people can really change after they've done something really bad? I considered his question carefully before responding. I think people can change, Marcus, but real change requires genuine understanding of the harm they've caused and sincere commitment to different behavior. Your mother has had multiple opportunities to demonstrate that kind of change, but instead, she continues to try to manipulate situations to her advantage. His younger brother Tyler was more direct in his concern, but she says she loves us and that she made mistakes because she was worried about taking care of everyone. Doesn't that count for something? This question went to the heart of Rebecca's manipulation strategy. She was exploiting her children's natural desire to believe in their mother's love, while reframing her crimes as misguided attempts at family protection rather than selfish theft. Tyler, loving someone doesn't justify stealing from them or lying about them to medical professionals, I explained gently. And if your mother had really been worried about taking care of everyone, she would have discussed financial concerns openly instead of secretly taking money that didn't belong to her. I went on to explain that Rebecca's current behavior, including her attempts to pressure me into reconciliation through social manipulation, demonstrated that she still viewed other people as obstacles to be managed, rather than individuals with rights to be respected. The conversation was difficult for all of us, but I felt it was important for the boys to understand that my boundaries with their mother weren't arbitrary or vindictive. They were necessary protections based on her demonstrated pattern of behavior, and they would remain in place unless and until Rebecca showed genuine evidence of fundamental change in her approach to relationships. Over the following months, Rebecca's attempts to reintegrate into the community continued to create ripple effects that touched my life in unexpected ways. She found employment at a small accounting firm that apparently wasn't aware of her criminal conviction, and she began rebuilding her professional reputation by emphasizing her experience and skills, while minimizing discussion of the gap in her employment history. This professional rehabilitation troubled me not because I wanted Rebecca to remain unemployed indefinitely, but because it suggested she was continuing to construct false narratives about her past. The accounting firm had hired her to handle other people's financial affairs, apparently without knowing that she'd been convicted of systematically defrauding her own mother. Patricia investigated the situation and discovered that Rebecca had indeed misrepresented her employment history on her job application, describing her absence from the workforce as a period of family caregiving rather than incarceration for financial crime. This misrepresentation potentially violated her parole conditions and certainly raised ethical questions about her fitness to handle other people's money. The discovery of Rebecca's employment deception
led to a difficult decision about whether to report the situation to her parole officer and her employer. On one hand, I had legitimate concerns about Rebecca having access to other people's financial information, given her demonstrated willingness to commit fraud. On the other hand, actively working to sabotage her employment felt uncomfortably like the kind of vindictive behavior she was accusing me of engaging in. After consultation with Patricia and careful consideration of my own values, I decided to report the misrepresentation to the appropriate authorities and let them determine what action was warranted. My responsibility was to ensure that accurate information was available to people making decisions about Rebecca's trustworthiness, not to control the outcomes of those decisions. The parole officer's investigation confirmed that Rebecca had violated the terms of her release by misrepresenting her criminal history to an employer, particularly one that involved financial responsibility. She received a formal warning and was required to disclose her conviction to her current employer, which resulted in immediate termination when the accounting firm learned about her fraud conviction. Rebecca's reaction to losing her job was to blame me for vindictively sabotaging her attempts to rebuild her life. She couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge that her own deception had created the problem, instead maintaining that I was using my influence to punish her indefinitely for crimes she'd already paid for through incarceration. This response confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Rebecca's apparent rehabilitation was superficial at best, focused on managing consequences rather than accepting responsibility. A genuinely reformed person would have disclosed their criminal history to a potential employer from the beginning, understanding that trust must be rebuilt through transparency rather than continued deception. The employment incident also revealed how Rebecca planned to approach her post-prison life. Rather than accepting that her crimes had permanently damaged her credibility in financial fields, she intended to continue seeking positions of trust while concealing the information that others needed to make informed decisions about her reliability. This pattern extended beyond employment to her social relationships as well. Rebecca had moved back to our community and was attempting to re-establish friendships and social connections without acknowledging the true nature of her crimes or the impact they'd had on the people around her. She presented herself as someone who'd been unfairly punished for making difficult family decisions under stressful circumstances. Some people in our community were willing to accept this narrative, either because they hadn't followed the details of her case closely, or because they were uncomfortable with the idea that someone they'd known could be capable of such systematic deception. Rebecca exploited this discomfort by positioning herself as a victim of an overly harsh legal system, rather than a perpetrator of serious crimes. But others in the community remembered the extensive news coverage of her trial and the shocking details about the scope of her fraud. These people were less susceptible to Rebecca's attempts at image rehabilitation, and their skepticism created social tension that affected everyone in our overlapping network. I found myself in the awkward position of being asked to comment on Rebecca's character by people who were trying to decide how to interact with her. Some genuinely wanted guidance about whether she could be trusted, while others seemed to be seeking gossip or drama rather than serious advice. I developed a standard response to these inquiries that focused on factual information rather than personal opinion. I would remind people that Rebecca had been convicted of serious financial crimes involving systematic deception, and that her behavior since release hadn't demonstrated genuine accountability for those actions. I encouraged people to make their own decisions based on their comfort level with those facts. This approach helped me maintain my own integrity while providing useful information to people who needed to make decisions about their relationship with Rebecca.